In Part B of Chapter 5, we're going to look at photosynthesis. So we're going to define it and list where it occurs. We're going to describe the structure of chloroplast and look at the function of chlorophyll. We're going to learn the basic equation describing the events of the light cycle and the events of the Calvin cycle. Excuse me. So photosynthesis, by definition, is a process that plants and certain microbes use, and what they do is they trap light energy, and they use that light energy to do an energy conversion. So they convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. So we looked at in Part A a little bit about the greenhouse effect, and we talked about the fact that excess carbon dioxide is, we believe, leading to an increase in climate change. And so the question is, well, if we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, could photosynthesis, where they actually take carbon dioxide and convert it, could this actually slow down climate change? And so in order to answer that question, let's look at this actual process of photosynthesis. Now, first off, we know that it's going to occur in the chloroplast of a cell. And again, it's converting carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. So let's look at the chloroplast itself. Now, chloroplast, again, it's going to be found in plants and certain microbes. And so every chloroplast has an envelope. The envelope has an outer and an inner membrane. And then inside of this, you'll find what first off we call stroma. And so stroma is basically a thick fluid that's found inside the cell. And inside of that fluid, you'll find these flat disc-like structures that are called thylakoids. Now, these thylakoids, you'll notice, are found in stacks that we call grana. And so it's inside of these thylakoids that you actually find the pigment chlorophyll. Now, we know chlorophyll, again, it gives plants its green color because it's reflecting green light, but its main purpose is to absorb light energy, because we just said in the definition of photosynthesis that photosynthesis requires taking light energy and using it to do this conversion. So it's chlorophyll, the pigment plants, that actually attracts the sunlight, absorbs the sunlight, and in turn that causes electrons that are present in there to become excited. And once these electrons become excited, this energy conversion can actually take place. Now, if you look at the formula for photosynthesis, we know that plants are going to take in carbon dioxide, they're going to take in water, they're going to take in that light energy that's being absorbed, and they're going to use that to make C6H12O6, which is glucose, and O2, which is oxygen. Now, in order for this process to occur, there are two steps. You have the light reaction, and you have the Calvin cycle. Now, the light reaction has some very specific steps here that we want to look at. And this is found in your textbook, bottom of page 95 on over to page 96. And so what happens in the light reaction is this is taking place in those thylakoids. Remember the picture we looked at just a moment ago, that's those flat disc-like structures. And so the chlorophyll that's in there is going to absorb the sunlight, and that's going to excite electrons. And when electrons get really excited, they get ejected from the thylakoid membrane. And when this happens, it's going to be captured by something we call the electron transport chain, and they're eventually going to be picked up by an electron carrier that we call NADP. Now, when NADP catches an electron, it's also going to catch a hydrogen, and so it produces something called NADPH. In the process of these ejected electrons, water is going to be split. Now, we know that the formula for water is H2O. So if you split water, you produce hydrogen and you produce oxygen. Now, the hydrogen is used to replace these electrons in forming that NADPH. The oxygen is going to be released, and eventually this is what we exhale. As the hydrogen is pumped across the membrane, it's going to produce ATP. So the big picture here says that the light reaction takes in sunlight, and by taking in sunlight, it's going to produce three things. It's going to produce oxygen when water is split. It's going to produce ATP when hydrogen that was produced by water splitting is pumped across the membrane. And as electrons are ejected and are caught, it's going to produce NADPH. Now again, the oxygen is going to be released. The ATP and the NADPH are going to be used in the second step of photosynthesis, which is called the Calvin cycle. Now, the Calvin cycle takes place in that fluid-filled space of the chloroplast we call the stroma, and it's going to use an enzyme called rubisco to take carbon dioxide, which we know has one carbon, to join it with a molecule called RuBP that has 5 carbons, and when you take one carbon and you add 5 carbons to it, it creates a 6-carbon molecule. that 6-carbon molecule immediately breaks in half. Well, if you have 6 of something and you break it in half, you get 2 groups of 3. So these 2 groups of 3 carbon molecules are going to go through a series of reactions, and they're going to produce something called G3P. Now, G3P is important because G3P can become several different types of things. Specifically, it can become the sugar glucose. Now, a couple things that we know about the Calvin cycle is it takes 3 turns of the Calvin cycle to give off 1 molecule of G3P. And we know that it takes 2 molecules of G3P to actually produce a glucose. So if 3 turns give off 1 G3P, and you need 2 of them, that means it actually takes 6 turns of the Calvin cycle to produce enough G3P to make 1 glucose. Okay, so you'll need to make sure that you know these numbers as far as it's concerned. So again, the light reaction gives off oxygen, ATP, and NADPH, and then the Calvin cycle, if it spins 6 times, gives off enough G3P to produce 1 glucose. So the question is, can photosynthesis slow down climate change? Because we know it's going to take in carbon dioxide and it's going to convert it. So while photosynthesis does take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide present in fossil fuels that's being burned is being released into the atmosphere so much faster that it can be absorbed by photosynthesis. So although photosynthesis can convert some of that carbon dioxide, it's not enough to remove the excess greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And in fact, rising temperature may actually slow down photosynthesis and its effectiveness. And so we're going to look at that concept in the next section of Chapter 5.